Hello, welcome to this virtual program from Maine Historical Society and the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. I am Kathleen Newman with Maine Historical Society, and joining me today is Erica Nadelhaft from the Holocaust and Human Rights Center. Hello, Erica.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks so much for being here. So this is our educator workshop, History and Justice in the Classroom. And today is August 18th, 2021. Erica and I are going to introduce ourselves to you folks, and then we will get into the program itself. So I'm Kathleen Newman. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs at Maine Historical Society. I have been with Maine Historical Society for since 2014. And prior to my work here, I was a middle school and high school social studies teacher in Massachusetts and Connecticut for about 7 years. I also worked for the National Park Service, Historic Deerfield, Mystic Seaport. So my background is in classroom teaching, education, and in museum interpretation. And I'm excited to talk to you today about our newest exhibit at Maine Historical Society, Begin Again, Reckoning with Intolerance in Maine, and about some of the things, the resources that we've put together for teachers to use to teach the content of that exhibit. Erica, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Again, as Kathleen said, I'm Erica Nadelhaft. I'm the education coordinator for the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. And I also teach, although increasingly less and less, at the University of Maine up here at Fort Kent. Primarily what we do, or what I do at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center, is bring programming at no cost into schools, primarily middle schools and high schools, but increasingly younger grades as well. Programming around Holocaust education, social justice issues, civil rights, history, immigration in Maine, and a lot of anti-bias or confronting bias work. We work with students. We also work with teachers through our summer seminars and through professional development days that we do throughout the year. So I will be doing a presentation of one of our programs that's called Finding Your Voice, which is about the role of young people in social justice movements. And I'll be talking about how you can use this program in class or kind of build some of the work you may already be doing around this program. So I'm very much looking forward to it and hoping there will be lots of questions and comments and conversation about both of these presentations that you're going to see.
Excellent. We're looking forward to that. So folks, I'm going to present first. And what we'll do, I'll give my presentation. Which will go to about 10:30 or so. And we'll take a 5-minute break at that time. And then we will hear from Erica with Finding Your Voice. And the goal is to end around 12 o'clock. While I'm presenting, Erica will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. And I will do the same for her while she's presenting. And there'll be time at the end of each presentation for us to answer any of your questions. All right, so here we go. I'm going to share my screen real quick and talk to you folks a little bit about Begin Again and Maine Historical Society. So once again, I'm Kathleen Newman, Curator of Education and Public Programs at Maine Historical Society. Maine Historical Society, our campus is based in Portland, Maine, but we work with teachers and students across the state, both in person and virtually. I'll give you a little bit of background on Maine Historical Society, what we have here at our campus. We've got a research library where a lot of our collection lives, where teachers, students, the general public, of course, can access periodicals, photographs, manuscripts, maps, all kinds of wonderful historical material. We also have museum gallery space. The exhibits in our gallery change throughout the year. Typically, we do one big exhibit every year, and then a couple of smaller ones, maybe like 3 or 4 smaller ones that change at different times throughout the year. We also have the Wadsworth Longfellow House and the Longfellow Garden. This is the house where the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow grew up and where he started writing poetry. The house is interpreted to the 1850s. So this is a great place for students to come and kind of get a glimpse of what was this one family's life like in Maine, 150 years ago, and to learn about Henry Longfellow's, his work and his poetry. And we also live online in a couple of formats, which we're going to talk about today. Maine Memory Network is our online database where you can access not only much of our collection that has been digitized, but collections from collecting institutions, libraries, museums, all across the state of Maine. And we also provide a lot of virtual programming and K-16 resources that you can access online as well. And again, I'm going to be talking about some of those today. The focus of my presentation, though, is going to be on the content and the lesson plans for our newest exhibit, Begin Again, Reckoning with Intolerance in Maine. This exhibit is going to be open through the end of the calendar year, December 31st, 2021, at Maine Historical Society's gallery in Portland. It is also available online in a couple of formats, a 2D format and a 3D format. And I'm going to be talking to you about how you can, a little bit about how you can visit and access all those formats shortly. So a little bit of background on this exhibit. A pandemic, political unrest, violence, economic inequality in 2020, all these things have spurred conversations about intolerance and inequality in Maine and the United States. And during this crisis, many of us are asking, how did we get here and where do we go from here? So this exhibit explores these questions and examines the roots of social justice topics and aims to stimulate civic engagement and foster dialogue among Mainers and really anybody who visits the exhibit. The Black Lives Matter movement, political unrest, COVID-19, Begin Again explores Maine's historic role in these crises and the national dialogue on race and equity, and invites the public to reevaluate ideas, items, and policies of the past 500 years and an entrenched system which has led to today's civil, economic, and environmental upheaval. The exhibition also provides a framework to consider perspectives other than the dominant narrative and envision a more inclusive and equitable future for all of Maine's residents. These are our curators of the exhibit. Ann B. Gass, who is a historian and an author, Crystal Williams, a lawyer, businesswoman, and community leader, Dr. Darren Ranko, who is a UMaine professor and citizen of the Penobscot Nation, and Maine Historical Society curator Tilly Lasky. And these co-curators also worked closely, they worked closely together, of course, and also solicited a lot of contributions, guidance, and advice from a diverse group of community experts like Mary Albinato, David Friedenreich, Dr. Andrea Louie, Sherry Mitchell, Jennifer Neptune, and many more who've contributed to this exhibit. Now, you can visit the exhibit in person at our Congress Street location, 489 Congress Street in Portland. You want to make sure that you check our website, mainehistory.org, to stay up to date on our hours and our pandemic protocols, what we have in place to keep the collections, our staff, and our visitors safe. Right now, we are open Wednesday through Saturday, and we are asking everyone on our campus when they're indoors to wear masks. And there are parts of the campus that have a limited capacity to ensure social distancing. And there are some things on our campus that also require a reservation. The exhibit does not currently require a reservation, but we highly recommend purchasing a ticket ahead of time on our website to ensure that you can come and visit at the time, the date and time that you would like to come. And when you visit the exhibit in person, there are two different paths that you can take. And whichever path you choose comes back together in a loop that brings you back to the start of the exhibit to reflect and consider who benefits from our past and our current systems. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the online components later too. So again, this is an exhibit that explores those different paths that you can take. One explores more the dominant narrative of 500 years of history, and the other path explores the stories that often do not get told. And you can, when you come into the exhibit, you can start with either path. Certainly, we would like everyone to plan a visit where they could stay long enough to do both of those paths. But how you go through the exhibit, which order you do it, that's really up to you, the visitor. And throughout the exhibit, you'll find some reminders of some of these important threads that go through Maine history, the blankets and the bowls. Wool blankets and sugar bowls serve as these physical and visual reminders. The blankets serve as a reminder of every treaty the governments of Great Britain and the United States have broken with Indigenous people in Maine. If I go back, you can see some of the blankets. They're sitting right here. They're red and black blankets. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. And the sugar bowls are a reminder of the legacy of colonization and slavery attached to Maine businesses and industries. To support and to accompany the work that's done in the exhibit, further explore those themes and those histories, Maine Historical Society is also hosting a virtual program series where we average, I would say, 2 to 4 virtual programs every month. They're free. They're Zoom webinars, so they're done in the same style that this program is being done. Anyone can register and come to these programs, and then anyone can access them for free afterwards via our website. You can see the recordings, and you can see the recordings of the programs, not just from this series, but all the programs that we're doing. Topics have included talks with Eddie Glaude Jr. and Edward Ball, explorations on Chinese and Jewish history in Maine, panel discussions on Black history, and many more. I think a lot of these, the content speaks to much of what we're going to talk about today, certainly. So there's certainly good tools for teachers, and depending on what students you're working with, they may even be very accessible and very helpful for students to watch as well. We've also been developing lesson plans for specifically for grades 6 to 8 and 9 to 12 students. And I'm going to highlight some of those today. Some of those were developed as part of our commemoration of the state bicentennial, while others were specifically for the themes in Begin Again. And they've been written by MHS staff, but with the guidance and input of experts, scholars, community members. Some of the folks we've worked with are Isaac St. John of the Holton Band of Maliseets, Bridget Neptune, who's a citizen of the Passamaquoddy, Bob Green, Matthew Jude Barker, Susan Cummings Lawrence. So we're just like the exhibit was a collaboration where we saw, the input of experts and community members. That's been true with these lesson plans too. So we're going to take a look at some of those examples in a minute. And one of the things that you should keep in mind, if you decide to use any of these lesson plans, they were written for middle and high school students, but in such a way that elementary school teachers should be able to easily pull content or different activities from the lessons and adapt them for use in an elementary classroom too. And I also want to acknowledge that the content the lessons cover are of histories and communities that have roots that go back centuries, or in some cases, thousands of years in Maine. And they're ones that some students may already be familiar with and may themselves be a part of. It's also important to acknowledge that it would be impossible to cover every aspect of any community's history in Maine in just one lesson that spans 1 to a couple of days. These stories and these lessons shouldn't be confined to just one lesson. So even when you see like a lesson on, oh, here's a lesson on the Irish in Maine, the goal of these is not to say, here's your Irish lesson, we did it, we're done, that's the only time we're going to encounter those people or that history. These are topics and communities that students will encounter multiple times as they study history. And I think it's important as a teacher to acknowledge that with the students, that you're going to see these groups of people and hear these stories and some of these themes over and over again. So the lessons are sort of designed to really serve as an introduction or a review of a topic, a resource that you can kind of come back to again and again as you go, if you're going through, you know, a chronology in a curriculum, you can kind of come back to lessons at different points in time, or as jumping off points to research a variety of stories in conjunction with a curriculum that explores the many different people who have called what is now Maine their home for thousands of years. So let's take a closer look at some of these. So what I'm going to do now, we're going to take a look at some of the lessons and some of the stories and themes within them. And of course, these are also some of the stories and themes that you see in the Begin Again exhibit. I'm going to go over them, and then I want to give you guys some time to kind of just look at them for a few minutes yourselves. So I sent everybody PDFs of 3 of these lessons because they're not on our website yet. The first one I'm going to talk about is on our website. And so when the time comes for you guys to just kind of take a few minutes and look around on your own, I'll put the link to this lesson in the chat. And I'll put a couple other links that you might find helpful. But the other 3 lessons I'm going to touch on today, everybody should have gotten an email with those attached as PDFs. Check your junk folder if you didn't see it right away. And again, if you can't find it, put your email in the chat. And when we get to that portion of the presentation, I'll be sure to send it along. So the first lesson, the first major theme, Wabanaki studies. So wherever we are in what is now called Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. Wabanaki tribes are sovereign nations, and ongoing legislation provides insight into the political relationship between Wabanaki communities and the state of Maine. Begin Again explores this history, as well as the history of Wabanaki homelands, the Wabanaki Confederacy, diplomatic protocols and treaties, the leadership of Wabanaki women, and the Land Back movement. There are a number of lesson plans available through Maine Memory Network. That's our online database. We have a lesson plan library there. We've got a number of them on Wabanaki history, and this one, Nation to Nation, Treaties and Legislation Between Wabanaki Nations and the State of Maine, explores a lot of the same themes that are explored in Begin Again. So in the lesson, students explore Wabanaki activism, and they take a part in discussions regarding primary and secondary documents and the effects that these documents have and have had on Wabanaki communities. They also discuss the importance of sovereignty and self-determination, how Wabanaki voices can be amplified in nation to nation discussions of sovereignty and stewardship. It includes information on colonialism, decolonization, water rights, Wabanaki governments in the 21st century. I think this is one of the things I really like about this lesson, is it's one that you can access with students to learn not only about Wabanaki history, but also to help your students understand that the Wabanaki don't just live in the past. They are the first people of what is today called Maine, and they are here still. And the fight for their sovereignty to be recognized is ongoing. This is certainly a big theme of the Begin Again exhibit, and that's why I think this lesson would be a good one if you wanted to learn more about those themes. So again, a little bit later, I'm going to drop the link in the chat. You can take a closer look at that lesson. Now, one of the things I encounter a lot when I'm teaching, whether it's I've got a group of third graders in front of me, or a group of adults that are, visiting the Longfellow House from all parts of the country, is the misconception that Maine is not diverse and that New England had no slavery and really no connections to slavery. And both of these are categorically false. Maine's people and its history is diverse, and Maine has connections to Black history and slavery that go back 400 years. So this lesson is about Black history and the history of slavery in Maine. I'm going to talk for a moment about some of the content. A lot of it is about that history of slavery, and I'm talking about that now, not because that makes up the majority of this lesson, although it is an important part of it, but again, I feel like that is probably the most common misconception when I'm talking to people about Maine history, New England history, that this is a place, there were no enslaved people, slavery was not a thing here. It's just not true. So a lot of the many Black people in Maine in the 1600s and 1700s were enslaved, and Maine was very connected to the slave trade. Profits from enslaving people and the labor of enslaved people helped to build many of Maine's businesses and coastal communities. Maine shipbuilders and merchants participated in the slave economy through the trade of lumber, molasses, and rum. Susanna, an African woman who was about 20 years old when she was brought to Maine in 1686 as an enslaved person, is the first recorded African enslaved person in Maine. In the colonial era, in what is now Southern York County, so we're talking about Kittery, Elliott, Berwick, South Berwick, as many as 500 enslaved people, this is what we know of, were brought to the area by 186 white enslavers. In 1753, there were 21 enslaved people living in the greater Portland area, Maine's largest city. Free blacks also lived in Maine during the colonial period, many of them coming as seamen who worked on the ships that are coming into some of the major ports, also working down on the docks, loading and unloading the ships on the waterfront. By 1764, the number of Blacks in Portland had increased to 44, and to 322 that were living in Maine. The 1790 census lists 96,540 residents of Maine, 538 of whom are listed as non-white free persons. Now, in 1820, I'm sure this story will be familiar, Maine was admitted to the Union as a free state with the entrance of Missouri as a slave state. And this is designed to balance power in Congress between states that had slavery and states that did not. That same year, a federal law was passed that made participation in the slave trade an act of piracy. So there had been a law in 1808 that made importing enslaved people from other countries illegal. In 1820, that becomes punishable because it's an act of piracy now, it becomes punishable by execution. It's a capital offense. However, even though that, the international slave trade is illegal in 1808, and the punishments become very severe by 1820, it's still happening all the time. Many Mainers and ships out of Maine continue to engage illegally in the slave trade. And of course, domestic slavery itself was still very much a part of the US. And a lot of white Americans also felt that it was acceptable to continue importing enslaved people from Jamaica and other European countries. So despite what the laws might have been in terms of slave trading internationally, that doesn't go away. Now, many Black Mainers who are living here, whether it's after slavery has been abolished in this area, or after it's been abolished nationwide after the Civil War, many of them do find personal and economic success in Maine. When we cover some of those stories in the lesson, Narcissus Matthias, who is a native of Cape Verde, he came to Bangor in 1834. He owned his own delivery business. At one time, he had 7 wagons making deliveries throughout the city. And he owned and drove a 9-seater coach. So he was the first private individual in Bangor to own one of these. And he was also the first man to deliver ice to individual customers. Macon Bowling Allen, who is from Portland, he became the first Black lawyer in the United States in 1844. However, of course, this is a community that even with the successes that they find in Maine, still faced a lot of prejudice and discrimination. And so this lesson, Black History and the History of Slavery in Maine, this is one of the ones that I emailed to everybody. It explores that history and examples of the ways in which the community has succeeded despite that racism, and ways in which the community responded directly to it. Next lesson, Jews in Maine. So this lesson explores the Jewish community in Maine, people who have been coming to Maine as immigrants and as refugees for at least 300 years. One of the first Jews in Maine that we know about was Sussman Abrams. He came to Maine from Germany after the American Revolution, and he worked as a clothing peddler and a tanner until he died in 1830. More Jews start to arrive around the mid-1800s, mostly from Central and Eastern Europe and Russia, looking for economic opportunities and for a better way of life. The first synagogue in Maine was founded in Bangor in 1849. Maine's first Jewish cemetery was in South Portland, 1875, and the first dedicated synagogue in Portland, built in 1904. Now, a lot of Jewish immigrants come to Maine because they might come to another place in the United States first, like New York City, but they find generally they don't really like life in the big cities. They want to start a business of their own. They're less interested in working like in factories or working for someone else. They want to start businesses of their own. And Jewish businesses became very prominent contributors to the economy in large cities like Portland and Bangor, also smaller towns like Old Town, Bath, Calais, Livermore Falls. Women and children played really important roles in these family businesses. One of the stories highlighted in this lesson is the Unobsky family. Sarah Unobsky, if I'm mispronouncing that, my apologies. She persuaded her husband Joseph to leave Russia in 1903. So he leaves Russia first, comes to the US, starts his career as a peddler in Maine. So he goes like from farm to farm, selling different goods, and is sending money back to Russia to help bring the rest of the family over. So in 1905, Sarah and their sons Arthur and William joined Joseph. They settle in Eastport. They had another son after they moved here, Charles. Joseph died, so the father, the husband, he died in 1922, and Sarah and her sons, they continued to run this growing family business, where he starts out as a peddler, but then builds his own brick and mortar store. And Sarah was renowned for her, quote, unusually strong personality and far-sighted business acumen. Over time, the family expands their retail holdings. They build a commercial block. This is in Eastport that included a movie theater and other offices. And they were in business from 1911 until the 1970s. And in 1924, Sarah founded the first synagogue in Calais, hired a rabbi, and in an unconventional move, she actually named it after her husband, the Congregation of Haim Yosef. And it was for a while the first and only synagogue in Washington County until 1974. Now, because the Jewish population in 19th and 20th century Maine was pretty small, it could be hard for newcomers to find a place in a community where they could preserve their identity, continue with their traditions. But they find ways to do it and to better connect and support each other. I should also note too that there were a lot of social and community organizations that do not welcome Jewish members in the 19th and 20th century. There were a lot of hotels in vacation towns that would not welcome Jewish guests. So they create these organizations for themselves. Hebrew schools help teach down and pass down the values of Jewish culture to the next generation. Jewish summer camps, like the one that you see in this photograph, became very popular in the early 20th century. They help to reinforce Jewish traditions and teachings, and they bring together Jewish youth to socialize and to make friends. So if you want to explore more of that history, the Jews in Maine lesson is there for you. The last lesson that I'm going to talk about today is the Irish and the Ulster Scots in Maine. Now, Irish and Ulster Scots, or Scots-Irish people, have been coming to Maine for, again, as immigrants, refugees for about 300 years. Between 1629 and 1640, 20,000 people crossed the Atlantic to come to North America, and a lot of them were Irish Catholics and Ulster Scottish Protestants. So let me distinguish a little bit between these two people. Ulster Scots were Scottish Providents who moved, Protestants, I'm sorry, I'm not so good with the words today, who moved to Ulster, Ireland at the encouragement of King James I in the 16th century as a colonizing effort on behalf of the English crown to take over Ireland. And as a group, the Ulster Scots, they do pretty well in Ireland for several generations, specifically in the textile business. But then the English government bans the export of wool in 1698. And not to get too far into the weeds, but you get some other things going on too that are making immigrating look a little more attractive. So in 1718, the Ulster Scots come to an agreement with the Massachusetts governor, Samuel Shute, to come to settle what is now Maine, to quote unquote, hold back the native people who had wiped out English settlements along Maine's coast during King Philip's War. So the idea, and you should know too, the English Puritans that are living at this time in what is today New England, the British, that are on the other side of the Atlantic, tend to view the Irish Catholics and the indigenous people in North America in very similar ways, that they're not civilized. So when the Ulster Scots are first going to Ireland, again, the idea is that they're going to help colonize an uncivilized place. And when they're asked to come to North America, the idea is kind of the same, that they're used to living among the Irish Catholics in Ireland. So we're going to use those communities as a buffer between the Puritans and the indigenous peoples here. So because of this, and because the Puritans are also Protestants too, Puritans are generally more tolerant of the Ulster Scots than they were of Catholic immigrants, but the groups don't always get along. And that's something that we go into more detail in the lesson itself. The Irish come to Maine in large numbers for 100 years, from the 1820s till the 1920s, in particular during the Great Irish Potato Famine, which lasts from about 1845 to 1851. And as more and more Irish immigrants come to the United States, prejudice and discrimination against them grows. The mid-19th century, it's also a time of a lot of economic and social change in the US, and you have immigrants competing with people who are already living here for jobs. And one of the responses to this rise in immigration is the forming of a new political party, the American Party, or sometimes called the Nativists or the Know Nothings. You know, the phrase know nothing comes from, if you're a part of this political party and someone asks you about its activities, the response you're supposed to give is, I know nothing. I don't know anything about it. And they're really precursors, if you will, to the Ku Klux Klan. The Know Nothings use the Irish as scapegoats for society's problems, calling for restrictions on immigration, laws prohibiting people who weren't born in the United States from holding public office. In 1854, what you see happening in the image here, a mob in Bath burned a building being used as a Catholic church and also ravaged the homes of Irish Catholics. So this history explored in this lesson. Now, unfortunately, confronting prejudice and discrimination is something that all these groups, all these different peoples have in common. And it's something that it's important to discuss in those lessons. And this is a theme that's discussed or that is explored a lot in the exhibit Begin Again too. This photo of a Ku Klux Klan parade in Portland, Maine was taken in 1923. And it's another aspect of Maine's history that many find very shocking and surprising. And it's one that's explored very specifically in these lesson plans. The lessons on Black history, Jews and Irish all include information on the activities of the Klan. Little bit of background, the Ku Klux Klan or KKK is a white supremacist terrorist group that's first formed after the Civil War that used violence and intimidation to take away rights of African Americans. And by the 1920s, they're also actively working against immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. In Maine, the Klan held parades and gatherings and campaigned for politicians who shared their beliefs, worked for legislation that would limit religious freedom. You see a real resurgence of the Klan in this part of the country in the 1920s. By 1923, they reportedly had a statewide membership of 150,000 or 23% of Maine's population. The Klan saw a decline in membership and became less visible by 1930, but never completely left Maine. In 2017, the Ku Klux Klan left neighborhood watch recruiting flyers in Freeport and Augusta. So this is a history that can be very tough for us to confront, but it is most definitely a part of Maine's history. And it's something that you confront when you visit the exhibit, and that's explored in these lesson plans. There are still more lesson plans to come. We have one also on the Chinese in Maine and on LGBTQ history in Maine. Right now, those are waiting some expert review. So the lesson plans are written, but they're just kind of in sort of the editing stage as we get some experts to sort of look them over. But so these specifically are coming. One of the things I wanted to ask participants today is if there's anything else that you particularly would like to see, whether you've already visited the Begin Again exhibit, or you have plans to visit, or you're looking for, you feel like there's something in your curriculum that's missing, a community or a story that's really underrepresented that you could use more materials on. We want to hear from you. This is what we've got so far. There's also a lot more lessons in our lesson plan library. But is there something else that you think is missing that we can help you with? It's important to remember that the work Maine Historical Society wants to do with this exhibit, it doesn't end when the exhibit comes down. So the physical exhibit will close after December 31st, but it will continue to exist online. And the work is something that making sure that we're talking about hard history, and looking at stories that haven't always been told. That work is, we have a real commitment to make sure that that work continues. And we want the teachers that we work with to be a part of that. So before we, again, in a moment, I'm going to give you some time to do some exploring on your own. Before we do that, let's just take a look at some of the other resources. So ones that weren't designed specifically for this exhibit or that are not just lesson plans. A lot of you, I know we have a lot of familiar faces in the crowd today. A lot of you probably are already familiar with Maine Memory Network. But for those of you that aren't, let me just give you a quick look. So Maine Memory Network is our online database where more than 270 collecting organizations from across the state have come together to share digitized pieces from our collections. So a lot of what, if you visited the Maine Historical Library in person, a lot of what you'd see there, books, photographs, manuscripts, maps, you can see those on Maine Memory Network, but it also includes a lot of artifacts, so, clothing, tools, toys, furniture. They've been digitized and they've been put in this one place online, so that you don't have to visit each historical society individually. You can find them collected at this one database, over 45,000 different items. Anyone can access Maine Memory Network for free, and you can set up an account for free. You don't have to have an account on Maine Memory Network to use it. The benefit of having the account is that you can save and share things in albums. So if you're studying Black history in Maine and you want your students to put together like an album of primary sources, what can you find in terms of, newspaper articles or photographs that can give us some information on a particular person's story, or say you're studying like the Abyssinian meeting house and in Portland, and you want to know more about the people involved. You could create an album on Maine Memory Network. If you have an account, you can find things, save them in that album. Students can share them with you, share them with each other. You can look for things on Maine Memory Network with a simple keyword search, or you can browse. You can look for things from a particular organization or a particular town, a particular period in time. It's a great place to start, and to start with your students to really get them looking for themselves for good primary sources to study this history. Maine Memory Network is also where you can see the 2D digital version of the exhibit. So if an exhibit in person is not possible for you or for your classroom, you can do that visit. You can access all of this content virtually from Maine Memory Network. And the digital version of the exhibit usually has a little bit more than the physical version does too. That's the website there. I'm going to drop that in the chat shortly. mainememory.net is the address. There are lots of tools specifically for teachers on Maine Memory Network. So there's an education page on Maine Memory Network. This screenshot is a little old, but you'll find guides to how to use Maine Memory Network with your students. So if you're new to it, there are resources on there that can help you navigate it. Also, just guides on how to use primary sources with your students, if that's something that's new for you too. And there's also a lesson plan library. So all the lessons that I talked about today, if they're not in the lesson plan library already, they will be soon. There's lots of other stuff in there, like mapping in Portland, lessons on Henry Longfellow specifically. Well, we created a lot of lessons in the past 2 years for the marking of the bicentennial. We did a great lesson plan. We collaborated with Maine State Museum, State Archive, State Library to do a lesson on pandemics. So lots of great stuff in that lesson plan library. We also have the virtual learning hub. So in the past year, doing lessons and having access for students to material virtually certainly became very important. We can do virtual field trips, so that's another option. If you cannot visit Begin Again or the Longfellow House in person with your students, but you would still like for them to talk with an educator, with me, about that content, take a look at some of the historical artifacts, we can do that virtually. We did a lot of virtual field trips this past spring that went really well. There are also mini lessons, so like videos that are between like 5 and 10 minutes long that you can access for your students, or that they can access themselves to learn about like Maine statehood, or that's a screenshot of me showing them how to make butter. That's also a place where they can easily access online exhibits and some activities with those exhibits. And again, from the virtual learning hub, we link to our lesson plans in our lesson plan library. And if you want to learn more about how to use Maine Memory Network in the classroom, whether it's a group of teachers or it's you and your students, we can provide free demonstrations. You can learn how to access Maine Memory Network, search and browse, open an account, make an album. This is something that I used to do a lot of in person, but again, I can absolutely do it virtually if that's something that you're interested in. So let's take a minute to do some exploration. Here's what I want you to do, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen in a second too, so that I can see the chat and drop some things in there. I've done a lot of talking. Now I want you guys to take a few minutes and have a chance to really look at and dig in a little bit at what I've talked about. I want you to choose one of these things. One of the lessons that we discussed today. So remember, I emailed you the lessons on Black history, Jews in Maine, Irish in Maine. You should have PDFs in your email. The Nation to Nation lesson about Wabanaki diplomacy. I'm going to drop that link in the chat. Choose one of those, or choose something from the Begin Again exhibit. I'm going to drop that link in the chat too. Choose a historical item or other resource from Maine Memory Network, or something from the virtual learning hub. I'll drop those links in the chat. Spend a few minutes with it. And I want you to come back and describe one way that you can use that resource in your teaching this year. And I want you to share that, type it in the chat. I'm going to use this lesson plan. This is how I'm going to use it. Or I found this photograph of a Wabanaki basket on Maine Memory Network. This is what I'm going to do with it. It can be one thing, one lesson, a virtual field trip that you're interested in. Take a few minutes to look at it. We'll take like maybe 10, 15 minutes. I'm going to put everything you need in the chat. I'm going to pause the recording for a moment too. And we'll come back and through the chat. I'd love to hear how you plan to use this stuff. And then we'll have time for questions too. Okay. So I am going to stop sharing. And I'm going to put this stuff in the chat. Give you guys some time to look around. And once you start finding something you like and you're thinking about how you're going to use it, put your response in the chat too. Okay. All right. So first link that's coming your way is the link to the exhibit itself. This includes the 2D experience and the 3D experience. Okay. Next link is to the lesson plan, Nation to Nation, that Wabanaki diplomacy lesson. How much time do we have to browse? I'm going to say, let's say like 15 minutes. So at 10:05, we'll stop the browsing. Here's the Nation to Nation lesson. Let's see. Here's just a link to the lesson plan library itself. So if you're looking for some other Wabanaki based lessons or just some other lessons in general, here's the library. Oh, the virtual, the virtual learning hub. Give me a second. I'm going to bring that up. There's virtual learning hub, and then just Maine Memory Network is mainmemory.net. So take a moment. The question comes up. Feel free to put it in the chat, but otherwise 15 minutes, and then please come back with sharing us how you're going to use something you found in your work this year. In the meantime, I'm going to take a look at some of the other, I'm going to stop the recording and take a look at some of the other questions you guys have already posted. All right, so now that we've had a little time to look around some of those resources, and we're hearing back from folks, we'll just mention some of the ways that some of the things that people found that they think will be useful and ways that they want to use them. And this is also a good time that I'm happy to take questions. It sounds like the nation to nation lesson plan, a lot of people really like that one. Someone saying that this would be a good unit to couple with about colonization in North America and the takeover of indigenous land, culture, and the way of life. That's excellent. Someone else mentioned another lesson that we didn't highlight today, but this is great. The Maine at the moment of statehood, that will be a good one to use with the 8th graders as they lead up to the events, as they study the events leading up to the Civil War. A couple people mentioned that lesson. Again, nation to nation, using that to look at Wabanaki activism when discussing citizenship and the rights and responsibilities of citizens. I really like that take. That's a good one. Using a Wabanaki study lesson for an American literature class when studying Native American literature. Excellent. What else? Artifacts, talking about the history of slavery in Maine. A couple people have brought that up, how that's something that really needs to be discussed more. So that's good to hear. Immigration in the 1800s, so using the Irish and the Ulster Scots lesson to talk about immigration. Using the primary secondary source lesson plan, so the guide that's on Maine Memory Network, talking to students about how to use those two different types of sources. Someone found an image on Maine Memory Network of blackface, people performing in blackface, so using that to talk about the problematic use of digital blackface. Very good. People talking about just in general how they appreciate how rich with resources the organization is. So I'm glad to hear that. And some of the suggestions that you guys made in terms of other lessons, like talking about the disabled in Maine, women's history is certainly something that's underrepresented in our lesson plan library. Although again, within a lot of those lessons, you'll find stories of lots of Maine women, Wabanaki voting rights. This is feedback that we love to hear. So one of the other things that I'm going to put in the chat right now is my email address, which is kneumann@mainehistory.org. So if you have more suggestions, I want to hear them. If you have suggestions on, or feedback, I should say, on the lesson plans that we looked at today, particularly the ones that I emailed you, Black History, Jews in Maine, Irish in Maine, we would love to get your feedback on those. What are you thinking? If you use some of these things in your classroom, the way you guys are saying you're planning to use them, we would love to hear how that goes. What did the students think? Is there something, is there something else that you're looking for on Maine Memory Network that you can't seem to find? Please email me, let me know. I'm happy to help. Before we get to questions, just a couple more things on visiting Maine Historical Society. You can visit this exhibit in person. I know that this year doing field trips may just not be logistically in the cards, but if you would like to bring a small group of students to Maine Historical Society, we can accommodate a group of, like, I think 11 or 12 plus myself is what we're saying we can accommodate at one time if you would like to visit any of our exhibits or the Wadsworth Longfellow House. And everyone would have to be masked. And it would be a mostly self-guided experience because right now we're not offering any kind of guided experience on campus. That said, there's probably more that we could do if it was a virtual field trip. So if you're interested in something virtual, again, just contact me. Let me know if you can't see, if you can't visit Begin Again in person, but you think the content is something that would be important for your students to access. If you'd like me to talk with them about any of that content or work with you to bring any of these lessons plans to life in your classroom, please let me know. If in person just isn't an option, digital is certainly an option. I'm going to put one more link in the chat, and that is the link to, I can't find it. Here it is. This is the 3D version of Begin Again. So if you want that kind of immersive experience of visiting without actually coming in person, you can visit the 3D version online, and that is that's free. So a couple questions, and maybe Erica can help me with this if she spots something that I miss. I know in the Q&A, someone has asked, any advice on how to teach these lessons in communities that may not be very receptive to stories that stray from the master narrative? So my advice, and Erica may be able to jump in on this too. This might be something that she's going to speak to a little bit in her piece. Again, like I said at the beginning when I was talking about these lesson plans, I think it's important to acknowledge that in all parts of Maine, there are people who may already know these histories intimately, who may be part of these communities. That's not something that's visible by just looking at a student. You don't know which community they may be a part of simply based on what they look like or what their name is. So I think to acknowledge that up front is important, that all of this is Maine history. And it's also important to not do it just once in a while, but to really make it part of your regular curriculum, to touch upon these stories throughout a unit from beginning to end, to make it not feel so, well, we're talking about something that we don't usually talk about, but to say we want to provide important context for this all the time. And to do, to talk to the administrators in your school too about just how can I make my classroom a place where students feel safe to have discussions that may not always be easy discussions. The other thing that I'll add is at the end of every lesson plan are resources, additional resources for teachers. So if you're looking for more information on how to tackle these topics and to tackle them well, there are a lot of other books, videos, websites, places that we recommend you use that you can find embedded within those lessons themselves. Erica, is there anything that you wanted to add on that question?
I'm gonna say maybe. We'll see if what I have to say really applies, because interestingly, I just did a presentation about doing this type of work in a place that is not sort of naturally receptive or actually resents the fact that I was coming in to do this work, and that sometimes it takes an awful lot of preparation and putting yourself sort of in the place of the people who don't want you to be there or who don't want you to be talking, and saying, okay, how do I recognize where they are? I don't have to agree with them, but understand where they're coming from and find a way to make them part of or allies in this work or in this conversation, as opposed to if you simply go in and say, you need to know this, or your students, your children need to know this. The automatic reaction is one of defensiveness, it's one of anger, or it's one of resistance. So it's often more time sometimes than we'd like to have to devote to the prep work. And I say this because very recently, and I will not get off much on this tangent, but I did a presentation for the National Guard, because this type of work is now mandated from above. And I was warned in advance, they do not want you here. They are not interested. So an incredible amount of preparation went into how do I start the conversation? And they were sold. It absolutely brought them in as allies in the work instead of as opponents to the work. So it takes a lot of time, and it takes knowing your audience, not just knowing your students, but knowing the parents, knowing the community in which you work, and figuring out, and sometimes all the preparation in the world, they, they're still not interested, or they're still angry. But I think kind of the stuff that goes on before you start the work, and the atmosphere and environment that you create from day one in your semester with your students about respectful listening, valuing of others and whatnot, is really important.
I think that's really good advice. And I think, I mean, this is work that the that the Holocaust and Human Rights Center, works on with communities all the time, right? So you guys probably also have resources that you recommend, like via your website, that would be helpful for anyone that's looking for more guidance on this.
Yep, absolutely. And by all means, reach out to me, if you are about to start something that feels complicated, or that, just to have a chat, a Zoom chat or a conversation about, advice before starting this work, reaching out to parents or whatnot. By all means, don't hesitate. And I'm actually going to put before we start, I'll put my email into the chat, my HHRC email.
Excellent. Thank you.
I will try.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Erica. So I think that those were, we've touched on all the major questions. Again, if you have questions for me about the beginning and exhibit, about the lesson plans, about other virtual learning tools and Maine Memory Network for your students, you can contact me directly. I'm happy to help you out, to help out your students, or to set up an experience for you guys. But in the meantime, take a look at, continue to explore these lesson plans and these tools and resources on your own, and let us know what you think and what else you would like to see. Again, this work is ongoing. The exhibit itself, oh, it did, sorry, Erica, your email just went to the hosts and panelists. I'm going to copy it, make sure it goes to everyone. That's okay. I do that all the time. It's Erica that's okay. I do it too. Erica at hhrccmaine.
I also spelled it wrong, only one C.
There's only one C. Okay, we'll paste it.
HHRC Maine.
Erica at hhrcmaine.org. Perfect.
There we go. Technology is not my friend.
It's okay. We're all in this together. The other like I said, continue to look at those lesson plans. Let us know what you think. Maine Historical Society tomorrow is hosting Matthew Jude Barker, who is one of the experts that helped us with the Irish and Ulster Scots lesson. He is going to be giving a talk on the know-nothings in Maine. If you visit our website, mainehistory.org, you can sign up to join that webinar as well. If you can't join the live webinar, a recording will be available on our website in a couple weeks. So thank you guys so much for listening to me. And I hope that you'll be able to visit Begin Again soon, whether in person or virtually. And I hope that these tools that I've shared with you today will be helpful. We're running a little bit ahead of schedule. It's almost 20 minutes past 10. So what I think we can do is we'll take like a 5-minute break. Let's come back, or let's say a 7-minute break. We'll come back at 10:25. Okay. So if you want to go get a refill on your cup of coffee, or you got to let the dog out, whatever you need to do, take a few minutes for yourself. And when we come back, Erica is going to take us through finding your voice. All right. So take a minute and we'll be back shortly. All right, everyone. So we are back, and thanks again for being here. It's time now for the second presentation today, Finding Your Voice, with Erica Nadelhaft from the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. Take it away, Erica.
Okay, thank you. I will try to share my screen. So bear with me for a minute, because as you already saw with me trying to put my email up there, technology is not always my friend. And I want to make sure I share sound and video. Aha, and I trust you can all see this. All right, hang on just one moment till I can find a way to start the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so I can skip the introduction since we did that earlier on, but I'm going to be presenting for you a program called Finding Your Voice. And this is a relatively short presentation that we bring into classrooms throughout Maine. And it talks about really the crucial role that young people have played and continue to play in social justice movements that have really fundamentally changed society. So why is a program like this so important now? Or maybe I should ask, why is a program like this still so important? Our students are facing a very unsettled, to say the least, world. Many of them, by a fairly young age, are exposed to social media and news about all sorts of different and frightening topics. Protests, unrest, violence, racism, school shootings, bullying, youth suicide, climate change, political divides, really just to name a few. And now we have a global pandemic with all the increasingly violent and threatening community and national divisions that this brings with it. And so how scary this must feel when one is young. Actually, how scary this feels at any age. When one is young, though, one can feel especially helpless and voiceless. But young people do have a voice, and young people have consistently had a voice. I've talked with many teachers as they've grappled with how to talk to students about complicated and often polarizing social issues, how to integrate ideas about social justice into the classroom, and how they can engage students in thinking about, talking about, and pursuing related projects. Empowering students, helping them to research and act on issues that affect their schools, their communities, their state and country is really terribly important. And this program can be a useful tool in your arsenal. It can be easily adapted for different grade levels. And as you'll see, when I'm presenting this program, I often stop in the middle to ask students questions or to have them ask questions of me. Different teachers obviously handle this in different ways. Some like to have students write down their thoughts while I'm talking. Others let students utilize the chat feature, and others want an actual conversation going on. Some use a combination of all three. The version of the program that you're going to see today is one that I did for a bunch of 6th graders. And again, if you're interested in a program like this, by all means, send me an email and we can talk. So this past school year, I had the wonderful experience of working with 6th grades in a school down on the coast of Maine. We did it via Zoom, obviously. And the teachers there had already put together an excellent unit that had students researching an issue that interested them and then looking for ways in which they could make change in their own local community. And they were just 6th graders, but they were bravely tackling all sorts of difficult topics. So I'm going to present this program to you. And then afterwards, I'm also going to run through the questions that I used with these students. And the students were engaged, they were talkative, and they were really full of determination to make a difference in the world. So the start of our program. So at the heart of what we're going to talk about today lies injustice. We're going to talk about that, and maybe even more importantly, we're going to talk about the need for us to speak up when we see injustices occurring. You might have been told, or maybe you even believe, that just because you're young and still in school, you haven't yet learned enough to be able to respond to the things that are going on around you. Or maybe you feel that the adults around you should be the ones speaking up. Maybe you think that because things don't involve you directly, you don't need to speak up. But I'm here to suggest that when you really look into American and world history, you're going to learn that young people, not all that different from you, have been speaking up since the time of the Revolutionary War. In fact, young people have been at the center of nearly every important social movement in American history. So this quote says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." So take out a piece of paper and a pencil and jot down some ideas about the following questions. And while you're watching me present this, if you want to put some of these ideas or thoughts of yours in the chat, by all means, please do so. So students, what do you think this quote means? Injustice everywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Take a few minutes, write down your ideas, and then we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. Now, I think it means that if we let prejudice or discrimination or violence happen toward any group, even if it doesn't affect us personally, it can pollute our entire society, and that it really taints everything that grows out from that soil, because other people's suffering matters, even if it's not ours. And one of the things that we'll see in this presentation is that young people just like you are some of the most profound truth tellers that we have, and that we as adults should be listening to them and to you. You have important things to say. Make your voices count. So let's start with some of the current movements that are happening in our country. On Valentine's Day in 2018, a former student walked into the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School and started shooting. He murdered 17 students and staff, and he wounded 17 more. It was one of far too many school shootings that have taken place in our country in the past several years. But something made this shooting different, and that was the response of the young people involved. When the media descended, the youth came together the next day with a very clear and simple message. And that message was enough. They said enough. Enough shootings and enough dead students. But why should this matter to you? We haven't had school shootings like this in Maine. It should matter because these are ordinary students just like you, whose lives were shattered, and turned upside down by shootings in their schools. And they are frightened, and they are angry, and they are asking for help. What we just lived through is not okay, they told people. And they said, we need to start having honest conversations about mass shootings in this country. And so they said, we are going to march. So on March 24th, 2018, a little over a month after the shooting, they organized the March for Our Lives to make sure that we kept talking about it. Word got around, and on March 24th, there were marches. More than 800 marches around the United States that day, and even more around the world. Millions of people participated. Millions were being led by young people just like you to say enough. But they knew they could not leave it there. And they knew there needed to be more than marches because they didn't want to just fade out with the news cycle and be forgotten. They organized and strategized and decided on a bunch of different tactics. Let's take a look at some of what they did. And here's where I've been having technical glitches, but we will hope against hope that my video is going to play. And again, I can't see the chat. I can't see any of you. I'm trusting that you are all reading me loud and clear. And if not, I hope Kathleen will step in.
Dying. I will fight every single day.
I just want to speak.
We call the end.
These students survived a shooting at their school. Now they're leading a national movement for stricter gun control. Just days after the shooting, they called for school walkouts around the country, traveled to the Florida state capitol,
You failed us.
and planned a nationwide march. Some of them can't even vote yet. It's clear these students are doing things differently. Here's how. Never Again is leveraging social networks to mobilize faster than most movements before it, according to experts who study the rise of social and political movements. 1 week after the shooting, the Never Again Twitter handle is verified and has more than 81,000 followers. In just a few days, student leaders have crowdsourced more than $3 million through online campaigns and celebrity donations. They're also handling their own crisis control by directly responding to critics.
I lost a best friend. He was practically a brother. And I'm here to use my voice because I know he can't.
These survivors are presenting their personal stories of loss as part of their fight, converting grief into power by getting in the face of adults.
So, Senator Rubio, can you tell me right now that you will not accept a single donation from the NRA in the future?
So this movement grew and it continues to develop. And it included a huge focus on getting young people to vote. In the 2018 elections, youth voter turnout jumped from 20% to 36%, which is a 79% increase. But this is not the only movement involving young people, as you may know, because young people are also organizing to address climate change. Whoop, and once again, hang on. My screen has frozen. I do not know why. I am a little stuck. I'm going to stop screen sharing and see if I can restart. I apologize. I have no idea why my screen froze.
No worries.
I'm going to try again. If there would be a technical glitch, it would happen to me. So let me try once more. Share sound and slideshow. Nope, completely frozen. So I'm going to have to do my slideshow slightly differently. And I am going to just jump ahead. And unfortunately, this is the only way I can think to do it. It's just I'll have to pull the slides up like this. If you were getting it in the classroom, you would have the real thing. But unfortunately, I seem to be stuck with this. So pretend you're seeing a nice looking slideshow, just like the one Kathleen did. What about the Black Lives Movement? Here too, young people are front and center, demanding change and fighting to address the racism and prejudice that has existed for so long in our country. And I imagine that you've all heard about the murder of George Floyd and all of the national protests that erupted as a result. You've probably also heard that the police officers who killed him are being held accountable. One was already convicted and the other 3 will be on trial soon. But did you know that the most important evidence in the trial was a video taken by a 17-year-old girl? Danielle Frazier saw what was happening and took action. She couldn't stop what was happening, but she could get the evidence of it. Her video made all the difference in the case. These are just 3 examples of high-profile national and international movements being led by youth right now. Young people are being or will be disproportionately affected by these issues and feel a special sense of urgency. Maybe you're already involved in some way, and maybe you're feeling discouraged by how the old people in charge are not really doing much to respond. So now let's spend just a little time digging into some American history. Young people have been speaking up against injustice and trying to make change for a long time. It's nothing new. We often think that only adults make history. You've all learned about the American Revolution in school. You probably even remember some of the important people involved. But did you know that many of the main players in the revolution were young? Nathan Hale was just a 21-year-old school teacher when he volunteered to go behind enemy lines as a spy for the revolution. He gathered a lot of information, drew up maps of enemy formations, and participated in some sabotage against the British. He was ultimately discovered and arrested. He was marched to a small park in New York City where a gallows had been erected to hang spies. Asked if he had any last words, Hale said this famous line, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." And I'm sure you've heard of Paul Revere. He's the one who rode a little more than 12 miles shouting, "The British are coming, the British are coming," to gather revolutionary troops. And he was 41 when he did this. But do you know about Sybil Ludington? She was the daughter of a militia commander and is known as the female Paul Revere. After receiving news of a planned British attack against her father's unit, 16-year-old Sybil rode 40 miles through rain and through the night from New York to Connecticut, giving the same warning about a coming attack to gather her father's troops. So Paul Revere rode for 2 hours and Sybil Ludington rode all night. He rode for 12 miles and she rode for 40 miles. So maybe we should be calling Paul Revere the female Sybil Ludington instead. Jumping ahead a few centuries, one of the reasons that you're in school rather than at work is thanks to young people like these. In 1903, more than 10,000 children went on strike in Philadelphia to protest the long hours, the low pay, and the poor treatment they received working in textile mills. Some were missing fingers and thumbs, others were missing entire hands, and many looked malnourished. Though state law prohibited children from working before the age of 12, the law was very poorly enforced. In addition to working in textile mills, children also worked in factories and in mines. One investigation reported that the average hours of labor for children in Pennsylvania was approximately 11 hours a day and 60 hours a week for compensation of about $2.50 a week, which in the year 2010 would be about $60. Many children worked 65 hours a week, and in some towns, children were required to work as much as 15 hours a day from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. with just half an hour for lunch and half hour for dinner. So just think, children your age spending their lives like this. So to get public support for their situation, 300 of these children bravely marched 92 miles from Philadelphia to then President Theodore Roosevelt's home in New York City. And they stopped in communities along the way to raise awareness of their plight. People were moved by their story, and laws were then created to protect child workers, laws that are still in place today. And during World War II and the Holocaust, when the Nazis closed the Jews in ghettos and allowed them only about 350 calories a day on which to survive, it was Jewish children who smuggled food to the starving people. They snuck over the walls and they crawled through the sewer pipes. If they were caught, the Nazis shot them just like they shot adults. And when the Jews fought back in armed uprisings against the Nazis, these revolts were led by young people, male and female, who are mostly in their late teens or maybe sometimes their early 20s. They knew that they had little chance of surviving, but still they organized and they fought back. There we go. Back in the United States, many of the protests against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s and the early 1970s were led by young people. After all, it was teenagers aged 18 and 19 who were being drafted into the armed forces to fight with no say. These protests helped to shift public opinion about the war, and they became part of a larger movement that challenged traditional attitudes about wars and why we fight them. And young people also played a significant role in the civil rights movement. The struggle to give African Americans equal rights, equal treatment, and equal respect. And you've probably heard of Rosa Parks. She refused to give up her seat to a white person on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. What you probably don't know is that 9 months earlier, in March of 1955, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. She was coming home from school when the bus driver told her she had to give up her seat to a white woman who'd just gotten on the bus. "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady," she said. "I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." Well, she was arrested and became a plaintiff in a Supreme Court case, which ruled that Montgomery's segregated bus system was unconstitutional. And this is a famous picture from 1957 of 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford. She was one of the Little Rock Nine, a group of 9 African-American students enrolled in Little Rock Central High School. And they were initially prevented from entering the school by the governor of Arkansas. And it was only after the intervention of President Eisenhower, along with National Guard troops to escort them, that they were allowed to attend. So you can see that on her way to school, Elizabeth and others were surrounded by angry mobs, not just throwing insults, but also threatening violence. And this is a picture of the Greensboro Four in February 1960. Ezell Blair, who was 18, Franklin McCain was 19, Joseph McNeil was 17, and David Richmond was 18. And they were all students who decided to sit at a lunch counter. And that sounds like an ordinary thing to do, but it wasn't. The lunch counter was segregated and people of color were not allowed to sit there. But these 4 sat there anyway in protest, and they started a movement. By summer, the sit-ins had spread to more than 50 cities, and lunch counters were rapidly desegregating. And as one historian says, perhaps more than anything, the results of the Greensboro sit-ins showed the power of small groups of students prepared to stand alone if necessary. And this is May 1963. About 800 students left school and started a 10-mile walk to Birmingham, Alabama, to talk to officials about segregation. They were stopped by the sheriff's department, arrested, and jailed, but others kept going. By the time they made it to Birmingham, more than 3,000 young people were marching. And for days, while these children walked, the police sprayed the students with fire hoses, beat them with batons, threatened them with police dogs, and arrested hundreds. So as you can see, young people have made a crucial difference in America throughout our history. This is a picture of a woman named Danielle Allen. She has a really important message, and that is that young people are the ones who really clearly see many of the things that are not right in the world. And she says that we, the adults, the politicians, the business leaders, and others in positions of power, we need to start listening to young people and their diagnoses, as she calls them, of what's wrong. She says it's time for you as young people to speak up and for others to listen, so that then together we can work on some solutions. And so then if I'm giving this presentation, to a bunch of students, I usually pause and ask them to write down some more ideas and to think about, what do they think about this idea? of Dr. Allen do they agree with her? And why do they think that young people really might be better able to see what's wrong with the world around us? And I would also like you to stop and notice something very unique about some of the protest movements going on right now, the ones that I talked about in the beginning. They're being led by people who are younger than usual. It used to be when we talked about student-led movements that we were really referring to college students. But now a lot of movements are being led by high school students and even middle school students, by you. Now, we're going to end this presentation with a few words from Clint Smith, or today I'm going to try to end this presentation. We shall see if the video works. He's a poet, an author, a teacher, and a researcher, and he was asked to share his views on the topic of silence and speaking up and finding your own voice. And again, when I do this presentation for schools, very often, because this is this clip is a little long and it's quite intense, often the teachers show it beforehand and then they re-watch it with me during the presentation. So we shall see if it plays. I have no idea.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in a 1968 speech where he reflects upon the civil rights movement, states, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." As a teacher, I've internalized this message. Every day all around us, we see the consequences of silence manifest themselves in the form of discrimination, violence, genocide, and war. In the classroom, I challenge my students to explore the silences in their own lives through poetry. We work together to fill those spaces, to recognize them, to name them, to understand that they don't have to be sources of shame. In an effort to create a culture within my classroom where students feel safe sharing the intimacies of their own silences, I have 4 core principles posted on the board that sits in the front of my class, which every student signs at the beginning of the year. Read critically, write consciously, speak clearly, tell your truth. I find myself thinking a lot about that last point, tell your truth. And I realized that if I was going to ask my students to speak up, I was going to have to tell my truth and be honest with them about the times where I failed to do so. So I tell them that growing up as a kid in a Catholic family in New Orleans, during Lent, I was always taught that the most meaningful thing one could do was to give something up, sacrifice something you typically indulge in to prove to God you understand his sanctity. I've given up soda, McDonald's, French fries, French kisses, and everything in between. But one year, I gave up speaking. Figured the most valuable thing I could sacrifice was my own voice, but it was like I hadn't realized that I had given that up a long time ago. I had spent so much of my life telling people the things they wanted to hear instead of the things they needed to. Told myself I wasn't meant to be anyone's conscience because I still had to figure out being my own, so sometimes I just wouldn't say anything. Appeasing ignorance with my silence, unaware that validation doesn't need words to endorse its existence. When Christian was beat up for being gay, I put my hands in my pocket and walked with my head down as if I didn't even notice. Couldn't use my locker for weeks because the bolt on the lock reminded me of the one I had put on my lips when the homeless man on the corner looked at me with eyes up, merely searching for an affirmation that he was worth seeing. I was more concerned with touching the screen of my Apple than actually feeding him one. When the woman at the fundraising gala said, "I'm so proud of you. It must be so hard teaching those poor, unintelligent kids," I bit my lip because apparently we needed her money more than my students needed their dignity. We spend so much time listening to the things people are saying that we rarely pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It is feeling your flaws gut-wrench guillotine your tongue. It is the air retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is the sound after the noose is already tied. It is charring. It is chains. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. I will not let silence wrap itself around my indecision. I will tell Christian that he is a lion, a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. I will ask that homeless man what his name is, and how his day was, because sometimes all people want to be is human. I will tell that woman that my students can talk about transcendentalism like their last name was Thoreau, and just because you watch one episode of The Wire doesn't mean you know anything about my kids. So this year, instead of giving something up, I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you've ever needed is your voice?
Okay, so now thankfully I will stop screen sharing. Whew, okay. And I will say that normally when I am in front of a large group, that does not happen. And I even had done a test run this morning with my husband and it worked like a charm. So now what I'd like to do is, again, kind of talk through some of the things that I would be doing were I in your classroom or another classroom and working with your students. And the first thing we do is we talk about this video, which again, some of them have just watched for the second time. For some of them, if it's okay with the teachers, this is the first time they've seen it. And so as I say to the students, it's a pretty intense video. And you can see that he feels really passionately about things. And Clint talks about silence. He talks about our silences and the silences of others. And he says that we remember the silence of our friends much more than we remember the words of our enemies. And so what do you think that means? What happens when we stay silent or when others are silent? And of course, if you want to pretend to be the students and to type your own responses into the chat, that's fine, but you certainly don't have to. And we all fail to speak up sometimes, not just when we're young. Plenty of us fail at this when we're adults. We all stay silent sometimes when we know deep inside that we really should say something. But as Clint says, our voices matter and your voices matter. And we need to think about what we do and what we say when we see injustice, whether it's someone being picked on in school for their sexual orientation or a homeless person, as he describes, just asking to be seen as a human being. And that's hard to do because it can be really scary to speak up. Will we be made fun of? Will we then become the target of the bully if we open our mouths? But again, the heart of what Clint's saying is this: our voices matter, your voices matter, use them. And so as young people, you guys have a unique perspective from which to diagnose issues. You have important things to say, and you have important things to do. And it is our job as teachers, as adults, as professionals, to listen to what you have to say. And so again, now if I were in the classroom, most of the time I'm in classrooms where students have either begun work on projects, dealing with a particular social issue, or they've just started talking about social activism and what that means. But many of them have already chosen a topic and they're starting to research, or they're starting to come up with an action plan. And so the rest of my conversation is based on that assumption. Obviously, if I've gone into a class where they're not doing this part of the piece I wouldn't bring in, or, I would adapt it. So back to talking to students. So now let's really talk. But before you tell me about the projects you're working on, does anyone have any questions about anything that I talked about? Don't be shy. Please don't be shy. I've thrown a lot of different and probably new information at you. And as an example, so that you don't feel alone if you're thinking, oh, maybe my question is silly, maybe I don't want to speak up. What if nobody else has the same question? I recently did a presentation for a bunch of brigadier generals in the National Guard. And afterwards, there were a fair amount of questions, including one from a gray-haired general who'd been in the military for 40 years, who said, I'm going to ask one question out loud, and then the rest of the questions I want to ask you in private because they might be silly. It was a brigadier general, and he was still afraid to ask his question out loud because he thought it might be silly. In the end, it was not a silly question, but you're not alone. If you feel hesitant to ask a question, I would just encourage you to speak up, because if you don't ask, you don't know. So I've heard from your teachers that you're already working on speaking up. You're already thinking about what it means to be an activist, and that you've picked an issue that you care about and want to learn more about. So I'd like to hear you now talk to me about what it is you're working on. What's the issue you've chosen, and what's important to you? And usually when I do this in a classroom, once the conversation gets going, these kids are lining up to talk about this issue, the particular issue that they've picked, something that they're passionate about. And I've had kids, and again, I was doing this with 6th grades. The most recent time, they were tackling gun control. They were talking about abortion. They were talking about the climate. They were talking about voting rights. I mean, they were fearless in the type of things they were looking at. And I think they were partly fearless, or mostly because the teachers were absolutely behind them, and the teachers were invested in helping the students deal with and tackle these complicated issues. So what are you going to do about the issues that you've chosen? Because you've taken the first step with your teachers by doing some research and starting to write about these issues. And that's really important, because you have to know what you're talking about if you're going to talk to others and you're going to try to make change. But then we need to think about what should come next. Because simply writing your research paper, that's very good, but it keeps all your information, all your passion, all your concerns, all your worries within your classroom. And the goal of your project is to bring this work out into your community. So what comes next? What are some of the ways that as young people, you can make your voice heard? Any ideas? And then we sit and we usually brainstorm some ideas, sometimes in groups, sometimes they're writing things down, sometimes we're all talking out loud, silence and also reading at the same time. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. One thing that I tell students is useful to think about as they're brainstorming some ideas is, how have other people gotten you to pay attention to an issue? And who are you trying to get to pay attention? Are you trying to reach other young people? Are you trying to reach your peers or your school administrators or your parents or the school board or people in the community? Because what works for young people might not work with older adults. So for example, an older adult or an adult might write a letter to the newspaper and other adults would read it. But is that something that you would read or your peers would read? Or is it something you could write? You might be more comfortable on social media, on Instagram, on things that I absolutely have no idea what to do with. So then again, we really brainstorm some ideas that might work for what they've chosen to do. And we talk about marches or using different types of social media, again, depending on their age. Not every 6th grader has an Instagram account. We talk about giving a speech or maybe participating in a school assembly. We talk about protests, being somewhere we force people to pay attention, like some of the school walkouts that we saw during, the Never Again marches and things like that. Simply writing. Some students are very comfortable with the written word as opposed to speaking, or sit-ins or teach-ins. Some students actually, as a result of some of these programs that I did, wrote to their local lawmakers. Some wrote to their, the state, people in the state house. Some wrote to federal lawmakers. They could make posters, they could make bulletin boards. And they came up with wonderful, wonderful ideas. And then we usually end with, and this kind of ties in, I think, to some of the comments I'm seeing, what do you do if someone disagrees with you or argues back? Because that will happen. It always does. And so it's a really good idea to have a plan for what you'll do, to have backup, to make sure you have the support of your teacher, to make sure that you've really kind of practiced your presentation or what you're going to say. And so usually by this point in my presentation, I am out of time because the students, again, they tend to be very, very talkative. And usually I only have an hour in the classroom. So this is normally where I would end the conversation. And the conversation often continues after I've left with teachers emailing me or saying, could a particular student email to interview? And it often branches off into individual conversations with students as they're doing their work, as they're doing their projects. So again, I really apologize for my weird PowerPoint glitch. First time it's happened. I will have to work on that. No idea why. If anyone has any questions, any comments, I'm just reading the one from Sue right now. Yeah, silence. There are times when it's frightening to be the voice speaking up. Oh, not allowing the rebel flag in the background in Zooms. Oh, yeah. That's a question I get asked an awful lot. And one of the things that it's possible to do, and if anyone's interested, I can send you the link, is I have a wonderful essay about, or piece about, the history of the Confederate flag. And knowing the history of it is sometimes important and can be again a useful tool or something to just make people aware of. And I feel awful that you're dreading the school year ahead. But yeah, this is a tough time to kind of wonderful. Yeah, please send me an email, if you're interested in the essay, because I can't access people's emails from here. But absolutely, I would send it off, because that's a huge issue. I mean, people just, but it harks back again too to this idea of not just planning ahead, but knowing your audience, anticipating the pushback that you're going to get, and figuring out non-threatening ways, or ways to bring the people into the conversation that is not going to cause this initial defensiveness. Because once if you start off in that place, it is so difficult to break down those walls, or to have anyone listen to you with any sort of willingness to hear what you're saying. And again, I find it a very frightening time just watching, teachers and people being screamed at in meetings by parents and by community members, whether it's a discussion about masking in schools, or, the big thing now, critical race theory. Most of the people screaming about it have no idea what it is. So it is a threatening time, and I don't know if it's worse now than it was. I think it is, but there are times when one has to be silent because it is not safe to open your mouth, and to be able to recognize it as well, that there are times when your focus is protecting yourself, protecting your students, and simply keeping everybody safe. And that's really sad that has to factor in to some of these conversations that we have. But again, if anyone has any questions, any comments, and I swear if I bring this program or any other program into your schools, my PowerPoint will work.
No worries, Erica. I know a lot of people are asking, do you have a link to that article that you're mentioning?
I don't. It's something that I just have kind of filed away. So if there's a way for people to just send me an individual email, what I will do is I will find it, and but it may take me a little while. So you may not get it from me, 1 o'clock this afternoon, but I promise you will, if you send me an email, you will get it from me. because that is a really hot topic, or hot issue, with just kids with it on notebooks, or, a bumper sticker on their car with, swastikas too. Oh, gender identity, right? Yes, masking. Oh, yeah, it's just, I'm up here in Fort Kent. They just had a school board meeting, no masks in our schools, no masks, no social distancing, no nothing. And it was painful to watch. Luckily I do not have kids, and my kids have all grown up and left home. But there's absolutely no precautions. We are back to as if there was no COVID, and it wasn't pleasant. So yeah, it's in many places, it feels like this is an uphill battle. And it's hard when you are also as an educator, when you feel like you're all alone in your school, or, there are just a couple of you facing this onslaught of angry community members and angry parents, and even other angry students, sometimes other angry faculty or colleagues that you work with who really don't understand the value of the types of work that you and we are trying to do. So again, I would say if at the HHRC, we do staff development, we do teacher training, we will work with individual teachers to sort of to help with these issues. So certainly please reach out, as your school year is getting going, for any sort of, we're still working remotely, so it would be by Zoom, but and we will do it for a group of 3 or a group of 30, it absolutely doesn't matter. So
I put the link to the HHRC to your website there, so people can see, what other similar programs that you offer, or can learn how to get in touch with you guys as an organization.
Absolutely.
One of the other things that I'll mention too, just for teachers that are looking for community in general, in particular social studies teachers, I sit on the board of the Maine Council for the Social Studies, and we're trying more and more to offer more programming like this for teachers throughout the year. Our annual conference is coming up this November. We're hopeful. Right now we're planning that conference will be in person. So I'm going to drop that website into the chat as well. Just give me a second. But Maine Council for the Social Studies, you can also find us on, it's mainecouncilsocialstudies.org, and you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. The annual conference, save the date, is November 21st, 2021, and registration for that is going to be open soon. Now is the perfect time if anybody has any other questions. Again, if there are resources that you're looking for, anything that we mentioned today that for whatever reason we just can't share a link to in the chat, or that may have gotten lost, the links may have gotten lost in all the activity in the chat, please don't hesitate to email Erica and I if there's something you want to be reminded of. If you're saying, what was that website again, or where can I find that lesson plan again, or that article again, please just contact us directly. You guys do amazing work as teachers, and organizations like ours want to be there to support you in that work however we can. So for those that are maybe anticipating a tough year ahead, that are looking for resources, please don't hesitate to reach out, and whatever we can provide, we want to be here to support you in that work. So please don't at any time hesitate to reach out and to spread the word about what you've learned today to your other colleagues and friends. Erica, was there anything else? I think we're going to wrap up early today, which is
it would have been a little longer if my PowerPoint worked, because there was one other video, but I just,
it's okay. It was a great presentation, and I think that what we'll say too, when we wrap up early, I know one of the things when I leave a workshop like this is I often can't wait to dive into the stuff that they've shared. So right. Give our participants that time to start doing that now. But I want to make sure if there's anything else that you want to upcoming with the HHRC that you want to share, or anything else that you want to say, please go right ahead. Are there, Erica, are there any other like programs on your calendar that teachers should know about, or?
Right now we're done with our summer, training seminars. We just wrapped up our big, Teaching the Holocaust seminar on Friday. Right now we don't have any sort of statewide, presentations that we're doing, but we're starting to book individual presentations, for schools for particular classes, we've got some professional development, some, diversity work or confronting bias work that we're booking. But those are really done on an individual basis where, I would say, go on our website, which is, it's in development, but you can find most of our programs are up there, and kind of skim through them. And if there's something that appeals to you or that is in the general area of what you're interested in, you just send an email off to either me or to, there's an email address on, on our website where you can request information. And that email funnels along to me, and then I will respond, and we can talk. We can talk. Do I travel to Eastport? Only by Zoom at the moment. Yeah, Eastport. I'm in Fort Kent, so yeah, that would be a bit of a schlep.
Yeah, I think one of the.
I occasionally, I did go to Augusta to do this, this presentation for the Guard. We're advertising 2 positions because it's hard for me at the top of the state to get to enough places. So primarily it is by Zoom, but all of our programs can be tweaked in one way or the other. It's not a one size fits all program. So we try again to meet your class or to your group to meet them where they are, and kind of take it from there depending on what you're working on.
That's great. And I think one of the opportunities that has really come out of not really having much of an option besides doing things virtually, for the past year or so,
Right.
Is it has, I think it's just opened up opportunities to consider how can we do these things digitally, virtually. I know that from Maine Historical Society, I think we're actually reaching more people than we ever have before because we switched so many things to virtual. And so while certainly it's unfortunate that, some things can't replace, being together and doing things. Yeah. It's great to know that both our organizations are willing to and able to meet people in places like this, through Zoom and through resources online.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Erica, and thank you everybody.
Thank you for having me.
This was really great. I learned a lot from Erica. I hope you guys have learned a lot about MHS Begin Again, and some of the history that we're with that exhibit and the programs and the lesson plans. Again, you guys do wonderful work as teachers. We want to wish you an excellent school year in 2021 and 2022. And please don't forget that if there's anything that we can do to help make that the best school year possible for you and your students, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thanks so much for spending some time with us talking about this important history and these important issues this morning.